Hi class, so in this video I am going to go over the instructions for the literacy narrative. So to start off with, I want to mention what a narrative is. A narrative is typically a story. Now it's not your typical story like, a story that involves plot line and characters and setting. It's basically a story that the writer tells. For example, a lot of narratives deal with like your most memorable moment or your most embarrassing moment or your favorite memory, your favorite place. So in essence, what a narrative is about is you tell a story that has some sort of significance. Now, like I mentioned, the story is about yourself. It's not necessarily your typical story with characters and fiction or anything like that. So with that in mind, a literacy narrative still has a lot of those elements that a narrative does. Like for example, it tells a story, but this one focuses specifically on literacy. And what we mean by literacy is either writing, reading, or language. So for the literacy narrative, what you're going to do is you're going to tell a story that has some sort of significance in relation to reading, writing, or language. Now, what a lot of students in the past have focused on, for example, they might have focused on the first time they learned to write, the first time they learned to read, or maybe they have some memorable events. Like for example, I've had some students who write about elementary, how they had reading programs where you would win like a pizza party or you would win some sort of prize if you read the most books. So some people say, they tell the story about how that contest really got them into reading. I've had other students who write about their favorite book, like whether it's Harry Potter or Twilight or some other type of book. They always mention how it was this book, the first book in a series, that really got them reading. I've also had other students who write about how they used to read a lot in elementary and middle school, but then when they got to high school or even maybe like 8th grade, they stopped reading because they started being on their phones or they started going online. So they write about that, how their reading habits changed. That's also an appropriate topic for a literacy narrative. When it comes to writing, I have a lot of students who write about how they struggled with essay writing. I also have a lot of students who write about maybe negative feedback they received from teachers back in elementary or middle school or even high school. I've also had students, when it comes to writing, they write about like the first college class that asked them to write. Or I've had students who, who write about their writing experiences in terms of like they moved away and they started writing to their friends, or maybe they were like in the army and they had to start reading or they had to start writing letters. So they focus on that. And when it comes to language, I've also had students who focus on maybe learning a new language, whether it be at work, whether it be in school. Some people talk about moving to a different country and having to learn a new language. So basically, all of these are good topics for a literacy narrative. Now, what you would do in the essay is you would tell the story of, how you encountered your first book or the first time that you had to write a long college essay or anything like that. So basically, you're telling the story behind this significant memory or moment that you have. Now, one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that this is an essay, so you are telling the story, but you have to make sure that you tell it in a way that makes sense to the writer. So because of that, there are some elements that we need. For example, each literacy narrative should have a thesis statement. Basically, what the thesis statement does is it keeps your essay organized, and for specifically for a narrative, the thesis should hint at the type of action that's coming. So in a narrative, the thesis does not tell you exactly what happens in the story, but rather it hints at what happened. So here I have an example. And the example is, as I stepped into the tutoring center for the first time, I never would have guessed that that place would change my view of writing and my career path. So basically, this is letting me know, the thesis is letting me know that this essay is going to be about how by going to tutoring, I changed my views on writing, and that also led me to change my career path. So I'm going to tell the story about my first visit at the tutoring center and how that changed my mindset. That's what that literacy narrative would be about. A literacy narrative, just like any other narrative, should also have very vivid details. So basically what you want to do is you want to appeal to the senses. So you want to go ahead and describe what you see, what you smell, what you hear. Now I know sometimes you're thinking like smell, taste, like why would I describe that? But you know, it just kind of depends on your memory, or it kind of depends what you are telling in your story. Like for example, if you're talking about your first day of school and you went to the cafeteria and you were eating something, maybe you remember how that tastes or smell. Of course, all of these details have to be related to the story and to the overall point, which is your thesis. But think about it that way. Think about it in terms of the reader wasn't there, so you're trying to place them in that moment. It's like the reader is going to go along with you in that memory. So you want to go ahead and provide details so that they understand what's going on. For example, besides providing vivid details that appeal to the senses, such as seeing, hearing, smelling, and taste, you also want to provide details so that the reader knows what's going on in the story. So, for example, let's say that you are talking about your first day in school. Well, you might want to say your first day of freshman year. It's important to be specific and provide these types of details because, you know, a lot of us, we've gone through 18 or more years of school. So if you just say the first day of school, the reader might be confused, right? Also, if you're talking about a specific book, maybe mention the title of the book. Also, you know, if you're talking about moving, tell us where you moved. Like if you moved to El Paso from California, make sure you mention where you were coming from and where you moved to, just so that we can get a sense and that the details can make sense. Because sometimes, like, a lot of writers assume that we know what's going on, but we were not there with you, so you need to go ahead and provide details so that everything makes sense. And also, you need to provide those sensory details so that we can picture the story and feel like we are there. So make sure that you describe everything very well and make sure that you provide important details so that the story makes sense to us. Which brings us to the next point, and it is a clear story. So again, in order for the story to make sense, you need to provide not only details, but you also need to provide a little bit of background information. So let's say you are moving cities or you are moving countries. You don't have to get too specific and personal and tell us why, but for example, you can say, well, we had to move because my father got a new job in a different city. So you can just go ahead and say that, and that will let the reader know the reason why you are moving. Or maybe you joined some sort of reading club. Tell us why you joined that reading club, right? So just give us a little bit of background information so that we know what's going on. Or maybe you hate writing, you've always hated it. Tell us a little bit why so that the story makes a little bit more sense. And if there's anybody involved, like teachers, librarians, parents, friends, make sure that you kind of mention who they are. That way we can understand what role they are playing. Because if you just say something like, she told me here, check out this book. Well, we're not going to know who she is. It could be anyone, right? But if you say, in 4th grade, the librarian recommended Harry Potter to me, then that makes a lot more sense and the story becomes more clear. And finally, the conclusion of your essay should always end with the significance of the story. So think about it this way. You are telling us a story about the first book you read, or about the time you moved and you had to write an essay or learn a new language or something like that. But why is this significant to you? And typically with literacy narratives, they all come down to your present feeling about reading, writing, or language. So, for example, if moving schools made you have no friends for a while and you would hang out at the library because you had just moved and you discovered books and the love of reading, why is that significant, right? Or maybe you're talking about your first day of college and you had to take an English class and you thought it was going to be so hard and you hate writing and you got through that class and you passed. Why is that significant? maybe it taught you that even though you hate something, you can still achieve something if you set your mind to it. So think about it that way. Why is it significant? We have a lot of memories in our head, so it's always important to think about, okay, why is this one so important? Why do I remember this one? What's so significant about it that I still remember it to this day? And lastly, this essay should be about 2 pages double-spaced, and you want to go ahead and use 12-point Times New Roman or 11-point Calibri font. And you do not need any outside sources because this narrative is about you. So you don't need to do research or anything like that. Instead, you want to focus on having a clear story, vivid details, and a good thesis. So I did want to mention that besides reading these instructions, you also want to go ahead and go to the modules, because in the modules, I have a literacy narrative module that could potentially help you. Also, make sure you check out the writing tools module, because the writing tools module has information about transitions, introductions, conclusions, thesis statements. So all of this module will help you with all of your essay writing. But the literacy narrative, I have a link that goes to writing a literacy narrative, and then I have a PowerPoint, and then of course I have the assignment right here where you can submit it. So let's go ahead and look at this. You are going to have to read proficiency, so here's where you can find it. But this also tells you a little bit about the key features of a literacy narrative, which are kind of like the ones I already mentioned, but you can go ahead and read this for a little bit more detail. And then what I like about this right here is that it also talks about choosing a topic, right? So like I mentioned, you can focus on, your first book you read, your favorite book, or anything like that. But you can also focus on a person who taught you to read or write. Or it could also be an event at school that was interesting, humorous, or embarrassing. I've read a lot of literacy narratives where students share that they hate reading because in elementary they would always have them read out loud, and they would get nervous or embarrassed because they couldn't pronounce things. So till this day, they still hate reading because of that. So it could also be a memento. Like I said, a lot of people like reading, and they like it because of a special book. I've also had people who write about, how maybe somebody gave them some sort of gift, and that led them to reading. So, for example, your literacy narrative could focus on that gift that someone gave you that led you to reading, or maybe somebody gave you a typewriter and that led you to start writing a little bit more. That could be the memento that you focus on. And of course, the origins of your current attitudes about writing or reading, whether you hate it or you love it. Why do you hate it or love it? I think this is a good assignment to really think about how you feel and to try to figure out why you feel that way. When we hate or love something, it's usually because of a reason. It's never just because. For example, I love reading, and the reason I love reading is because it goes all the way back to elementary school when we used to go to the library. The library was always a fun place to go because you were getting out of class. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes they had contests and they had book fairs, and, you could buy bookmarks and things like that. But it was also in the school's library that I discovered Beverly Cleary, and she wrote a lot of books that I really enjoyed reading back in the day. So for me, I've always associated reading as something fun because it was something that I really enjoyed when I was younger. Now I still enjoy it, but it takes me a little bit longer to get into a book simply because, I'm really busy with grading and work. And also now I read a lot of my articles. I read them on my phone. But for the most part, I do prefer to read a physical book. So, I still have that love of reading, but it's just become a little bit more difficult, so I need to retrain my brain to read a little bit more. But it's something that I still love. And I think a lot of us can maybe relate to that, where we still love it, but we just don't have the time. So that could also be the topic of your literacy narrative, how you love it, but life gets in the way. Or it could also be the opposite, where you've always hated reading, you try to get into it, you read magazines, you read books that interest you, but you just don't like it. So you could go ahead and tell the story of why you just don't like it. And Something else about reading is that don't think of it as, oh, well, I don't read books. It can also be blogs. It can also be social media. You know, like I said, I read articles online. So think about comics, anime, you know, stuff like that that you might love reading. And there could be an interesting story behind it. So don't just think about books. It could be magazines or anything like that. I used to love reading magazines back in the day, in the late 90s when I was in high school. And in the early 2000s, that was the way that we got information. So I like reading magazines, though magazines now are mostly online. So definitely go ahead and read this, because this also asks you some questions to help you start describing, like, for example, the setting and people and things like that. So this is obviously very helpful. I also want you to refer to our Little Seagull Handbook. So in order to access this, you should have bought your book, and then you should have bought the access card, and it gives you access to the ebook, and it also gives you access to the Little Seagull Handbook. So once you click there, if you scroll down, there is a section about not literacy narratives. It's about narrative writing. So it's called personal narratives. So if you click on there, it discusses narratives a little bit more in depth, and it basically describes everything that we've been talking about throughout this video. Again, it's a well-told story, it's vivid detail, and it's actually very similar to the link that I just went over, but again, it tells it to you in a different way. So as you can see, it kind of repeats a lot of the same information, but it says it in a different way, and it provides more detail. One of the things that I like about this particular section of the Little Seagull Handbook is that it tells you different ways to organize your narrative. Now, when it comes to the narrative, you can go ahead and tell it in the order that it happened, which is chronological. However, you can also begin in the middle. That might be a little bit more challenging, or you could begin at the end, where you start off with, I hate reading, I've always hated it, and then you tell us the story why. So this is kind of starting in the present, going back in time. It's sort of like a flashback, so to speak, right? So we already know how you feel, but now you're going to tell us why. When you begin in the middle, like I said, I think that could be a little bit more challenging, but it could also be like you begin in the middle, like you're sitting there in the school library and all of a sudden you see a shiny new book. And then you go back and tell us how you got there. And then you start the story from seeing the shiny book and then to now. So like I said, I think beginning in the middle is a little bit more challenging, but if you feel that you are up for it and you can go ahead and tell a clear story that way, then go ahead. I think that either beginning at the beginning of the story or beginning at the end are a little bit more effective for this type of literacy narrative. But you can organize it in whichever way you think makes sense, as long as you are telling a clear story. So, like I said, make sure you review this information as well. Make sure you review the PowerPoint as well. I'm not going to go over it, but it does talk about literacy narratives, and it even has a little bit of a definition. And then again, I don't know if you guys are starting to see a pattern here, but the key features, they all tell you the same thing. Something that the other ones don't mention is dialogue. Since it is a story, you can go ahead and put in conversation or dialogue. Like, for example, you could put, I screamed, oh my God, I've been looking for this book. And then you could say, the librarian replied, be quiet, you are in a library, or something like that. So you can actually put dialogue in there to make it a little bit more interesting, and just so that you're not just telling us a story, but you're showing us the story. And the significance can be, you know, any type of significance. It doesn't always have to be a moral lesson that you learned. And this PowerPoint also tells you like how to generate ideas and things like that. But definitely go ahead and go over all of this information before you start writing. We are also going to have a discussion that centers on literacy narratives, and we're also going to read 2 literacy narratives. One is proficiency, the other one is Se Habla Español, where she talks about learning her native language. And I think those are pretty good examples of what a literacy narrative should look like. And make sure that you read the instructions as well, and whenever you are ready to submit your assignment, I'll show you how you can submit it. So when you've gone over all the information I provided, you've watched this video, you've written your essay, you just go ahead and you click on Submit Assignment, and then you go ahead and you choose a file, and then of course you go ahead and you select the file, and then you just click Open, and it will show up right here, kind of like this. So here you have your essay, and then you can just go ahead and submit assignment. Now you can also go ahead and submit the essay through Google Drive or Office 365. If you use Google Drive or Office 365, it might prompt you to log in, so just make sure that you are aware of that. Now something else to mention, because this is going to be reviewed by Turnitin Software, which is the plagiarism software, you have to click here to agree to the end user license agreement. If you don't click here, it won't let you submit it. And once you submit the assignment, see, I have to agree. Once I submit the assignment, it will let me know up here which file I submitted. See, so it tells me that I submitted this essay right here. Now you want to keep in mind that if you realize you submitted the wrong essay, you have until the due date, which is right here, to go ahead and submit the essay. However, keep in mind that if you go back and resubmit the assignment, it'll delete this essay and it'll only keep this essay, the new one that you submitted. So if you want to submit multiple files, like for example, if you want to take this essay to tutoring and you want to submit the summary of tutoring form, what you would do is you would go ahead and submit both of them at the same time. So you would go ahead and do this, and then you would go ahead and click on add another file, and then you choose another file, and then you go ahead and you submit both of them at the same time. Because if you submit one at a time and then you go back and submit the other one, it deletes the one that you previously submitted. So I hope that makes sense. I hope I didn't confuse you. But in any case, if you have any questions, please let me know. I will be glad to help you regarding your topic, regarding your writing process, anything like that. And don't forget that the ARC is available in case you need help. And in order to access the ARC, you can just go ahead and click the tab, and you can go ahead and contact the tutoring coordinator, Nancy Kilgore, if you want to be added to the writing tutoring online. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'd be glad to help you.